Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So, today we're going to continue our discussion of animal behavior by talking specifically about mating behavior. When we think about evolutionary history of a species, we're talking about their reproductive success. So, when we look at a set of traits, the traits that ultimately become common in the population are the set of traits that are most beneficial for that environment. As a result, those are the organisms who had them pass them on more often because they were more adapted to their environment and so more reproductively successful. Hopefully that makes sense. So natural selection really does ultimately come back to who out reproduces compared to someone else, which means for organisms that are reproducing, their mating behaviors are very much closely tied to their evolutionary success. So, when we look at mating behaviors, we can talk about it really kind of stemming into four major categories. What do they do in order to seek or attract their mates? How do they choose those potential mates? Do they ultimately end up competing for mates, and how do they outcompete someone else for that mate? As well as if they provide any sort of parental care, what do they provide? How much do they provide? For how long do they provide for those offspring? So let's start with the idea of just mating relationships. What is the relationship that they develop between the male and female in that species? And realistically, these relationships vary incredibly widely from one species to the next, but they do seem to fall into three major types. So, if we look at a promiscuous relationship, this is a situation where in that species there really is no strong bond between mates. So, that male is mating with as many females as possible, she is doing the same. And there really is no pair bond, as they would talk about it. There's no lasting relationship beyond just the reproductive event itself. A monogamous relationship is where we have one male mating with a single female, pretty much for life, all right, or at least for some lengthy period of time. We often see monogamous relationships in organisms that tend to not have hugely differential morphological or physical differences between the sexes. So, looking at things like these seagulls up here, these guys don't really seem strikingly different. If we were to look at them, you probably couldn't tell which one was male versus which one is female. And so that would be a monogamous relationship. Polygamous relationships are where I have an individual of one sex mating with several individuals of the opposite sex. And so most kids, if they've come across that word before, I've probably heard more of the polygamist or the polygamy variation of that, where it's a single male mating with multiple females. So he sort of is the alpha in the pack, if you will. Wolves are common for this, but we also see it here in these elk. There are certainly lots of other species that do that. Typically, you see the males are much bigger, much more showy, whether it's in terms of things like the antlers or feather colors or something of that nature, that more easily distinguishes a male versus a female when you're looking at them in that adult form. So that's polygamy. It's one male mating with multiple females. There are situations, however, where you have a polyandry situation where it's same as the polygamy, but now it's the female who is mating with multiple males. And so, in terms of her physical characteristics, it's the same deal. She looks much more showy and much more attractive than the males do. And that's what we're seeing down here in these guys here, this particular bird species. Not nearly as common as a single male molting with multiple females, but there are instances that exist out in nature. So, not only do we need to just attract and then mate, But we also have to look at organisms that do, in fact, care for their young. So go back to that idea, those R versus K strategists. What are they doing? Remember, those R strategists, it's just reproduce, reproduce, reproduce. But they don't live very long, but they do produce a lot of offspring in hopes that some of them survive to adulthood. Well, those case strategists, on the other hand, right, were the ones who did a lot more of that caring. They didn't produce nearly as many young, but they were bigger, they lived longer, but that did then involve some more parental care. So the need to care for those young and the strategies with which species have evolved to do that really is constrained by their evolutionary mating systems. So when we look at the need for that parental care in these bigger, longer living organisms, the amount of time that they take care of caring for those young, and which sex, by the way, takes care of those young, really ties back to what we just talked about here in terms of the type of mating relationships that they get defined with based on that evolutionary history. So if I look at a species where birds are producing chicks, right, and those chicks need constant supplies of food, the male may maximize his reproductive success over evolutionary time by staying with his mate and helping his mate care for those chicks. So that would be something that would be more of a monogamous relationship. So both parents are taking on the role of caring for those young. Where we look at something like those bird species where instead of them needing continuous food supplies, they may now only need that food for a small period of time, and then eventually, relatively quickly after birth, they are capable of caring for themselves. Then it might be more beneficial for the male to look at a polygamous relationship where he can help his mate, but it's not a long term commitment because those chicks are able to quickly develop to a point where they can take care of themselves as opposed to needing much more long term care. So, mating behavior is also tightly linked to whether or not that particular species goes through external fertilization, something like the seahorses, where female kind of just spews her eggs out into the aquatic environment. Male does the same thing with his sperm. Hopefully, the sperm finds the egg and fertilizes, as opposed to internal fertilization, which is what we would typically think of from a human perspective, because female releases the egg into her reproductive tract. They have sex. Sperm finds egg inside the female's body. Fertilization happens there, and then ultimately, with that internal fertilization, either an egg is produced like we would typically think of with a bird species that mom kind of sits on and keeps warm and takes care of until it hatches, or something like our cats there, where we're looking at more of a internal development as well as a typical birthing situation post fertilization. So think about it this way: when we talk about internal versus external fertilization, really the mating behaviors that evolve in those species comes down to the question of paternity influences over parental care as well as the mating behavior itself. So ultimately, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's really vital. It's really important that individuals know whether or not their genes are getting passed on. And so their ability to have evolved this sort of confidence in their behavior, knowing that the sperm or the egg that they put out there ultimately produces offspring that then are connected to them, heightens their success from a natural selection standpoint. So we said natural selection comes back to driving the species forward because those genes are being passed on from generation to generation. So with females, that can be certain that the eggs that they lay or the young that they produce that are born contain her genes. She knows that. She's the one producing that fertilized system, whether it's the egg or the offspring. That being said, from a man's side of things, a male side of things, the paternity is considerably less certain. He'll mate, he'll inject his sperm, but the question then becomes, how certain is he that that female is carrying his young? So the paternity is relatively low in species that have internal fertilization. There's no way for him to know that he was, in fact, the sort of winner of the race, right? His sperm are the ones who made it, because it's quite possible that she has mated with multiple males without him being aware of it, right? And so it's often in those internal fertilization situations where the male is far less likely to expend energy past that just initial fertilization point. He doesn't really participate in paternal care because he doesn't know that those young are definitely his. And so he's not going to expend the energy from an evolutionary standpoint taking care of those young if he can't be certain that they're his. That being said, that paternal certainty goes up and becomes higher if there is an egg that's being laid and that mating occurred together in a resulting external fertilization process, in which case it's just as likely for a male or a female to be the one who takes over the parental care in that situation. So hopefully that makes sense. So internal fertilization, it's far more likely to be the female of the species who is participating in parental care if that species does in fact do that sort of behavior, because the female knows it's her offspring, the male isn't quite so sure. External fertilization, it's much more of a 50-50 split as to who potentially takes care of the offspring, again, if that parental care exists, because that external fertilization allows that male a much higher degree of certainty that that offspring is in fact his, and so he will expend the energy to take care of it, just as likely as the female would do because she's laid the egg, and so once again, she knows that those genes in that offspring belong to her. In organisms where we see what we call sexual dimorphism, right? So a male versus a female looking physically, morphologically different. So the sexes have some clear differences between them. We get a resulting sexual selection, which is just a form of natural selection based on mating behaviors. So this term will come back up as we get into evolution more heavily this year. But just to sort of bring it up, since it does show up here now, we can talk about natural selection in the form of these mating behaviors, this sexual selection, as intrasexual versus intrasexual selection. So take a look at those prefixes, and that's what makes these terms different. When we look at intersexual selection, this is mate choice. So one member of the species is considerably more showy, whether that's showy in terms of physical characteristics or it's behavioral or it's some combination of that. And so one sex will choose their mate to produce those offspring based on those characteristics. It's often talked about as female choice because overarchingly we see this more in polygamist relationships where the male is the one trying to entice the female. That being said, it's not impossible to have examples go the opposite direction, where a male is choosing female based on her characteristics. But think about it from this perspective. If we're talking evolutionary drive, it's more likely to be female because she is the one who often is going to spend more time taking care of those offspring, right? So, female choice is being driven by her desire to choose a male that has the best characteristics, the best set of traits, the best set of genes that will ensure the health and vitality of her offspring. And presumably, the anatomical and physical features of the male she chooses are tied to his health. So, if we look at something like the peacock, if you think about it, why on earth would natural selection produce this male who is brightly colored, um, beautiful feathers, when clearly that does not allow him to camouflage himself in his environment, right? This makes him more susceptible to his predators. It would seem like this would be a maladaptive characteristic, and yet we see it across the board in peacock species. We see it in lots of organisms, birds in particular, that are these brightly colored males that don't blend up into their environment. And the reason we believe that this is the case is because somehow that coloration, that flashiness, is tied to their set of good, healthy traits, at least according to the females in their population. And so the females are more attracted to these big, flashy males. They're the ones who mate more often. And so that's the traits that have become synonymous with their species. So that's the idea of female choice. Intrasexual selection is now competition between the same sex in a species for mates. And more often than not, we see this predominantly being male to male competition. So that competition, once again, overarchingly reduces the benefit to the male, right? Because he may die, there may be extra energy expended to compete that could have been used for something else. And yet, this competition is such a driving force for reproductive success that even though it's maladaptive for both males to participate in it, the benefit of winning the right to mate with that female overarchingly supersedes the potential cost. So the males compete and they gain that resource, in this case, the access to the female. There are a lot of other interesting offshoots to strategies that species have evolved over time to be reproductively successful. This is just one of those potential offshoots, and that's the idea of mate choice copying. So it's a behavior that occurs a lot of times in females where she sees one female mate with a male and automatically assumes, well, he must be the hottest commodity out there, so I'm going to go mate with him too. So she copies his mate choice without necessarily even really spending the time to see what this male is all about, right? So think about the situation here with these guppies, right? They put 3 different males into a tank, give a single female the choice, and she kind of just mates with whoever, right? There really doesn't seem to be any driving force based on their coloration as to why she would pick one male versus another. But they stick 2 females in the tank, one that's a model, right? So she's not necessarily really really a fish, the real female. But if that model appears to preferentially choose a male, that female fish will then go after that same male, even though in the controlled sample she didn't end up bothering with him at all. It's an interesting thing. So it's that idea of wanting something you can't have. And think about all sorts of human interaction, right? All of a sudden, a particular boy, or even girl for that matter, becomes more desirable simply because somebody else decided to go after said boy or said girl. So just kind of think about that when you watch interactions in the cafeteria or the hallways or in the media as to why that particular male all of a sudden becomes the hot commodity, the one everybody wants to be with, and it's often because of our sort of underlying animal instinct to mate choice copy. Game theory is another interesting way to look at mating behaviors. So this particular concept, when applied to behavioral ecology, is looking at all these alternative strategies. And the outcomes of those strategies depends not only on the individual's mating strategy, but also on the strategy of others. So when we look in certain species, sexual selection is driven by the evolution of alternative mating behaviors and morphologies in males. So the fitness of a particular phenotype, so whether that's behavioral or morphological, not only depends on themselves, but depends on the other variation in phenotypes of the individuals in that population. And let's see if this example helps that to make sense. So we look at these side blotched lizards, right? And if we look in the picture, you really have these sort of three categories of males based on their coloration patterns, their throats in particular. So you've got your orange males here, all right, your blue males, and then your yellow, what they call yellow males. And it's interesting the way that they work because it's sort of like playing rock, paper, scissors in terms of their three different phenotypes and the strategies that they then use in order to be reproductively successful. So each strategy's outcome depends on the other strategy that somebody else has used. So the success overall is dependent on the frequency of all the strategies used as opposed to just being this versus that. So it's frequency dependent. So what are we talking about here? Well, each of these males, these different coloration patterns, have a unique strategy unto themselves as to how they successfully mate. And this is why their phenotypes continue to perpetuate generation after generation. So those orange males are going to be the ones that are most aggressive, and they're going to defend these large territories in their environment. So any other male that comes in, they are super aggressive. They run them out of town, essentially, and then continue to ensure that they mate with a group of females within this big territory that they defend. But that takes a lot of energy, and also the being the more aggressive male sets him up for the potential to fail in that competition. Your blue males will be slightly territorial, they will be aggressive, but nowhere near the level to the orange. So they will defend a considerably smaller territory than those orange males will. As a result, mating with fewer females, but probably still being overarchingly successful in getting their genes to get passed on to some level. But the benefit here is being less aggressive, attacking fewer males sets themselves up for the ability to be slightly more successful in living longer as a result, having more potential for mating to occur. Your yellow males are really kind of interesting because they are not territorial at all. And in fact, they look much more like a female. So their strategy comes from taking advantage of the fact that those orange and blue males will be aggressive in some level of defending their territory. And so while those males are off fighting other orange or blue males defending their territory, these yellow males come in and they're sort of sneaky because they will come in, they will mate with that female, and the males, the orange and blue males, never really seem to go after the yellow males because they assume that they're female. So he kind of comes in, sneaks in, mates with the female under these more bigger, aggressive males' noses, and has now provided his opportunity to pass his genetic material on while the other guys are off fighting it out.